I never thought my own parents would treat me like disposable labor, but that's exactly what happened. For context, my family owned a mid-sized company that had been around for decades. It wasn't massive like a Fortune 500, but in our region, people knew the name. It had started with my grandparents, who worked themselves to the bone to build something respectable. By the time it passed down to my parents, the company was solid, profitable, and even expanding. Growing up, I was always told this company would be our family legacy. I took that seriously. At 18, while most of my friends went off to college parties, I was working 12-hour shifts at the warehouse, learning the business from the ground up. Later, I studied business administration at night while working full-time for my parents. It wasn't glamorous, but I believed I was investing in my future and our family's future. My brother Ethan, on the other hand, was a different story. He was always the golden child. He breezed through life with this smug confidence, always assured that mom and dad would bail him out of whatever mess he created. In the company, he had one of those vague creative director roles, which basically meant he could stroll in around noon, chat about ideas, then leave early because he was networking. Everyone knew he wasn't doing any real work, but my parents defended him endlessly. Still, I kept grinding. I was the one negotiating contracts, ensuring payroll went out on time, keeping suppliers happy, managing crises, and making sure clients didn't walk away when deliveries were late. I was the one sacrificing weekends, skipping holidays, staying until midnight while Ethan was out at bars claiming it was business development. Then came the recession. The company struggled like everyone else. We had to cut staff, freeze salaries, and tighten expenses. I worked harder than ever, cutting deals, finding cheaper suppliers, even renegotiating leases to keep us afloat. I thought I was indispensable. I thought if anyone was safe, it was me. I was wrong. One morning, my parents asked me to come into their office. The moment I stepped in, I felt the tension. My mom avoided eye contact. My dad sighed heavily, like he was about to deliver a eulogy. Then he said it, "We've had to make some hard decisions. To keep the company alive, we're letting you go." First, I thought I misheard. I actually laughed, waiting for the punchline. But they were serious. They framed it as a financial necessity. "We just can't afford your position right now." I sat there stunned, my mind spinning. They weren't firing Ethan. They weren't firing the guy who barely worked. They were firing me. I asked, "Why me? I'm the one holding this place together." My mom mumbled something about family harmony and how Ethan's role is more forward-facing, harder to cut. That was when the knife twisted. It wasn't about money. It was about keeping Ethan comfortable while I was sacrificed. I walked out of that office in a daze. I packed up my things in silence while coworkers whispered. Shocked. I couldn't even look at Ethan, who smirked like he'd won something. And as I drove home, the reality hit me. I wasn't just unemployed. I had been discarded by my own parents, erased from the company I had poured my soul into. The ultimate insult? 2 months later, I heard Ethan had gotten a raise. A raise. After all the hard decisions. After all the talk about survival. They rewarded the laziest person in the building, while I sat at home unemployed. That day, something inside me broke. I wasn't just angry, I was done. Done sacrificing. Done being the reliable one. Done believing loyalty mattered. And deep down, a quiet, dangerous thought began to take root. One day, they'll regret this. The first few weeks after being fired by my own parents were some of the darkest in my life. Losing a job is painful in any context, but losing that job, the one I believed was my inheritance, my life's work, my identity, was like having the ground ripped out from under me. Friends tried to comfort me. They said things like, "You'll bounce back, you're smart." Or maybe it's a blessing in disguise. I nodded, but inside, I was hollow. For a while, I didn't even update my resume. Every time I opened my laptop, I'd freeze. How was I supposed to write about my experience? Should I say I worked for my parents' company? Should I gloss over that? Would potential employers think less of me if they knew my own family didn't value me? I spiraled. Days bled into weeks. I avoided phone calls. Depression hit me like a freight train. Meanwhile, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Ethan was thriving in my absence, or at least pretending to. He'd taken over some of my responsibilities but was reportedly outsourcing most of them or just letting things slip. Still, my parents bragged about him at family dinners, acting like he was single-handedly keeping the company alive. I stopped attending those dinners. I couldn't stomach sitting at the same table with the people who had tossed me aside. It was anger, not hope, that finally got me moving again. One morning, I woke up and thought, they don't get to define me. They don't get to be the reason I rot in bed forever. So I forced myself to apply for jobs. At first, I aimed low, just trying to get something stable. But then I saw a posting from Ironcrest Industries, a direct competitor of my parents' company. I hesitated. Was it petty to apply there? Would it make me look desperate? Then I realized something. Who better to understand their industry than me? I knew suppliers, clients, seasonal patterns, and common pitfalls. I had been the one solving the problems my parents and brother ignored. So I applied. The interview process was grueling, but I crushed it. When they asked about handling crises, I had real stories. When they asked about streamlining operations, I explained how I had saved my parents' company thousands by renegotiating shipping contracts. They were impressed. I was offered a managerial role, not glamorous, not high-ranking, but solid. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of dignity return. Working at Ironcrest was surreal. On day one, I realized how different the culture was. People respected competence. My boss actually listened to my ideas. My coworkers valued collaboration. It was like stepping into an alternate universe where effort and talent mattered. I threw myself into the work, determined to prove my worth. Not to my parents, but to myself. And something incredible happened. I excelled. My projects didn't just meet expectations. They exceeded them. Clients noticed. Vendors appreciated my straightforwardness. Within a year, I was promoted. By year 2, I was managing entire teams. By year 3, I was in executive strategy meetings, shaping the direction of the company. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, thriving at a competitor, while my parents' company began to show cracks. I heard whispers, late payments to suppliers, high turnover among staff, clients jumping ship. At first, I tried to push it out of my mind. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was just trying to survive and build something for myself. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the sense of poetic justice. Ethan, of course, continued his charade. Rumors reached me through old coworkers. He was more arrogant than ever, strutting around as if he were the savior of the business. My parents enabled it, ignoring warning signs, pouring money into his half-baked expansions that never materialized. Meanwhile, I was building real success, quietly, steadily, away from their shadow. There's a strange kind of healing that comes from realizing you don't need the validation of the people who hurt you. At Ironcrest, I learned that my value wasn't tied to my last name or to my parents' approval. My worth came from my results, my work ethic, my ability to lead. People respected me here, not out of obligation, but because I earned it. But as much as I tried to move on, I couldn't fully escape my family's orbit. Because with every step forward I took at Ironcrest, I also saw them slipping further down. And a part of me, a part one didn't want to admit existed, was waiting for the day they would need me. Waiting for the day the tables would turn. At first, I thought I'd managed to put real distance between myself and my parents' company. I focused on Ironcrest, climbed the ladder, and poured my energy into building something new. But in a relatively small industry, whispers travel faster than facts. No matter how much I tried to ignore it, the signs of my parents' company's decline kept creeping into my world like cracks in a dam. It started innocently enough, little comments from suppliers I had relationships with. Someone mentioned delayed payments. Another hinted that my parents' company was asking for longer credit terms than usual. First, I shrugged it off. Lots of businesses struggled with cash flow from time to time. But then a former coworker, someone who had stayed after I was fired, reached out privately. She told me morale was in the gutter, that several talented managers had quit, and that Ethan had become more unbearable than ever. According to her, Ethan strutted around like he owned the place, making promises to clients he couldn't keep. forcing employees into overtime to cover his mistakes, and throwing tantrums if anyone questioned him. My parents, blinded by their devotion to him, defended him no matter what. They poured money into his projects, most of which fizzled before they even got off the ground. Meanwhile, the real backbone employees were leaving in droves. I should have felt sad. After all, this was my family's legacy. But if I'm honest, my first emotion was grim satisfaction. They had chosen Ethan over me. They had gambled on incompetence and nepotism. Now the bill was coming due. But the cracks didn't stop at whispers. Soon I saw public signs. Industry newsletters reported that my parents' company was closing one of its locations. A big client, a retailer I had personally brought in years ago, moved their contract to Ironcrest. Not because I asked, not because I poached them, but because they were fed up with Ethan's broken promises. And every time something like that happened, I felt conflicted. On one hand, I told myself I didn't care. It wasn't my problem anymore. On the other, I couldn't ignore the poetic justice. The very things I had warned my parents about, Ethan's irresponsibility, their blind favoritism, their refusal to adapt, were the exact things dragging them under. It all came to a head at a trade conference about 6 years after I'd been fired. I was there representing Ironcrest, now in a senior role. My parents' company was also there, though with a much smaller presence than usual. Their booth looked sad, half the size it used to be, staffed by unfamiliar faces. Ethan was there, too, wearing an expensive suit that didn't quite fit, grinning like he still ran the world. When he spotted me, his grin faltered for just a second before he plastered it back on. He strutted over and said something snide like, "Wow, I see you finally found a place that would take you." His words were meant to sting, but the desperation in his voice gave him away. He needed to believe he still had the upper hand. What he didn't know was that half the vendors at that conference had already whispered to me about unpaid invoices, broken promises, and late deliveries from his side. He was burning bridges faster than he could build them, and people were starting to jump ship. That night, in my hotel room, I stared at the ceiling for hours. Part of me wanted to laugh at the irony of it all. Part of me felt vindicated, but there was also a nagging unease. As much as I hated to admit it, this wasn't just some abstract business rivalry. This was my family. Their collapse wasn't just numbers on a balance sheet. It was the undoing of something my grandparents had sacrificed their lives for. And for the first time, a new question entered my mind. What would I do if they came to me for help? Because at the rate things were going, it was no longer a matter of if. It was a matter of when. It happened sooner than I expected. Just a few months after that trade conference, my phone rang late one evening. I almost didn't answer when I saw it was my mom. We hadn't spoken properly in years. Our conversations had dwindled down to obligatory holiday greetings and awkward updates passed through relatives. But something in me hesitated, and I picked up. Her voice trembled. "Can we talk?" I braced myself. Small talk wasn't her style, especially not after years of cold distance. She went straight to it. The company was in trouble. Serious trouble. Sales had plummeted, creditors were calling, and they were on the verge of defaulting on major contracts. "We thought we could weather it," she said, her voice breaking. "But we were wrong. We need your help." For a moment, I just sat there in stunned silence. The words I had imagined hearing one day, "We need your help," were finally real. 1,000 emotions crashed into me. Vindication, anger, sadness, and yes, even a twisted sense of satisfaction. But instead of answering, I asked her something that had burned inside me for years. "Why me now? You had me once. You fired me. You kept Ethan. Why should I help you now?" There was a long pause. Finally, she whispered, "Because you're the only one who knows how to fix this." And there it was. Not love. Not reconciliation. Not regret. Just need. I could almost hear the calculation in her tone. This wasn't about mending our relationship. It was about survival. I told her I'd think about it, then hung up. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down. Part of me wanted to scream, part of me wanted to cry, and part of me wanted to laugh at the sheer audacity. After everything, After discarding me like I was nothing, they wanted me to swoop in and clean up their mess. A week later, my dad called. His approach was different, less emotional, more businesslike. "Look," he said, "things are bad. We can't keep up. Ethan's doing his best, but he's only one person. We need someone with your skills." The irony was almost unbearable. Ethan, doing his best? The same Ethan who partied on company credit cards, who couldn't manage a project without it falling apart. The same Ethan they chose over me? Now they were asking me to come back, as if I'd been sitting around waiting for their invitation. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I told them I was busy with Ironcrest and couldn't make any decisions right away. But inside, I felt a storm brewing, because this wasn't just about business, it was about everything they had put me through. I started hearing more details through the grapevine. Employees were fleeing in waves. Long-term clients were defecting to competitors, many of them directly to Ironcrest, though not because of me. Ethan had apparently tried to innovate by launching a flashy new division that burned through millions with nothing to show for it. My parents were mortgaging personal assets to keep the business afloat. It was a full-blown implosion. One night, my sister-in-law, Ethan's wife, actually showed up at my apartment. We'd never been close, but she was desperate. She begged me to set aside old grudges and think of the family. She even said, "If the company dies, Ethan will never recover. Please, you can't let that happen." I looked her dead in the eye and asked, "Where was that energy when I was the one discarded?" She had no answer. The pressure mounted. Extended relatives called, guilt-tripping me. Old family friends hinted that I had a responsibility to protect the family legacy. Even my grandmother, sweet, frail, well-meaning, called me in tears, begging me to help for the sake of your grandfather's memory. And that one stung, because my grandfather had been the reason I worked so hard in the first place. I wanted to honor him, to build on what he created. But at the same time, I knew he would never have condoned the betrayal my parents had inflicted on me. I was torn in two. On one side, my loyalty to the legacy, to my grandparents' sacrifices. On the other, my loyalty to myself, the self that had been humiliated, discarded, treated like nothing. As the calls, visits, and pleas kept coming, one thing became clear. The collapse wasn't just imminent. It was inevitable. And then, out of the blue, Ironcrest's CEO called me into his office with a single line that made my blood run cold. "We're considering acquiring your parents' company." When my CEO at Ironcrest told me they were considering acquiring my parents' company, my heart stopped. I sat frozen in his office chair, unsure if I had heard him correctly. He must have noticed the look on my face because he leaned forward and clarified, "Your family's company is circling the drain. We've been watching the numbers. They're drowning in debt, hemorrhaging clients, and at this point, the only way they'll survive is if someone steps in. And frankly, they're small enough now that buying them would be more efficient than competing with their scraps." My chest tightened. The words were clinical, but the meaning wasn't lost on me. Ironcrest didn't care about family drama. They saw a weakened rival and smelled opportunity. Business was business. I tried to play it cool, keeping my voice steady. "And you want me involved because?" He gave me a look, the kind a chess player gives when they know the next 5 moves on the board. "Because you know that company inside and out. You know its strengths, its weaknesses, its skeletons. If anyone can integrate it or dismantle it, it's you." The room suddenly felt suffocating. All the memories of long nights, unpaid sacrifices, and my parents' betrayal came flooding back. I had wanted them to regret firing me. I had wanted them to feel the consequences of choosing Ethan over me. But I had never envisioned it happening like this. I managed to say something non-committal, like, "I'll need some time to think," before leaving his office. But once I was alone, I couldn't stop shaking. That night, I barely slept. My phone buzzed non-stop with more messages from family members begging me to step in and save the legacy. They didn't know Ironcrest was already circling. They still thought this was about me swooping in to take over operations, maybe lending a hand. None of them could have imagined the truth. I wasn't being asked to save the company. I was being asked to help dismantle it. The following week, I was brought into closed-door strategy meetings. The acquisition team laid everything out. My parents' company was sitting on valuable assets, warehouses, client contracts, distribution networks, but they were hopelessly mismanaged. Ironcrest could absorb those assets, liquidate the rest, and come out stronger. As I sat in those meetings, my emotions were at war. Part of me was exhilarated. After years of being treated like nothing, I was in the driver's seat of the very process that could erase Ethan's cushy throne and force my parents to face the reality of their choices. But another part of me, the part that remembered my grandfather's calloused hands, the way he used to tell me stories about building the business from scratch, ached at the thought of letting it all be gutted. At home, I stared at the ceiling night after night, imagining the fallout. My parents would see me as the executioner. Ethan would call me a traitor. Relatives would vilify me. But then I'd remember the look on my mother's face when she said, "Ethan's role is more forward-facing, harder to cut," while tossing me aside like dead weight. Every fiber of my being screamed that this was justice. Things came to a head when my dad called again. His voice was tired, strained, desperate. He admitted that the banks were circling, that bankruptcy was becoming a real possibility. He begged me to come back and take over operations, to be the savior they once refused to let me be. And that was the final twist of the knife. Not because I couldn't help, but because I could. I had the skills, the knowledge, the leverage. If I wanted to, I could probably still pull them back from the edge. But I didn't tell him that Ironcrest was preparing to buy them out. Instead, I told him I'd think about it. He thanked me like I was some kind of hero, completely unaware that I was already sitting in meetings about how to divide up his life's work. The next morning, Ironcrest's CEO asked me point blank, "So, are you ready to lead the acquisition team?" When my CEO asked me if I was ready to lead the acquisition team, I hesitated just long enough for him to notice. It wasn't that I doubted my ability. I knew my parents' company better than anyone alive. I knew where the bodies were buried, which contracts were ironclad, which clients were worth saving, and which warehouses were money pits. But this wasn't just a business decision for me. This was personal in a way no one in that room could understand. Still, I heard myself say, "Yes, I'm ready." With that one sentence, I crossed a line I couldn't uncross. From that moment on, I wasn't just an employee at Ironcrest. I was the executioner wearing a polite corporate mask. My job was to carve up the company my grandparents had bled for, the company my parents had betrayed me for, and deliver its best parts to Ironcrest. The team dove straight into due diligence. Mountains of financial documents, audits, employee retention rates, vendor contracts. I had access to everything. And what I saw confirmed what I'd already heard through whispers. The place was a mess. Ethan had run wild, pouring money into vanity projects with no ROI. Payroll was bloated with his friends in cushy, consulting roles. Entire departments were understaffed while Ethan's pet division had more resources than it knew what to do with. I tried to keep my emotions out of it, but every spreadsheet felt like déjà vu. I remembered arguing with my parents about these very issues years ago. I remembered showing them numbers, warning them of the trajectory, begging them to rein in Ethan's reckless spending. Back then, they told me I was being negative. They said Ethan was a visionary who just needed room to grow. Now here I was, staring at the smoking crater his vision had left behind. At night, I wrestled with guilt. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, hearing my grandmother's voice in my head. "Take care of the family legacy." But then another voice, the bitter, wounded part of me, would counter. "They didn't care about you. They chose Ethan. Let them choke on their choices." The hardest part was hiding what I was doing. My parents kept calling, pleading with me to come back and fix things from the inside. Ethan even called once, slurring his words from what I assumed was a late-night drinking binge, telling me I'd always been jealous, and that real leaders take risks. I didn't bother responding. If anything, his arrogance only steeled my resolve. Then came the site visits. As part of the acquisition process, I had to walk through the company's facilities with my Ironcrest team. Stepping back into those buildings was like walking through a distorted dream. The warehouse I once stayed in until midnight was half empty, machines idle. The break room where I used to share coffee with coworkers was silent, plastered with job postings for competitors. People recognized me. They whispered my name as I walked past, some with hope in their eyes, some with suspicion. One longtime employee, Mrs. Jenkins, actually grabbed my arm and said, "You're back? Thank God. Maybe now things will get better." I didn't have the heart to tell her the truth, that I wasn't there to save the company, but to dismantle it piece by piece. I just smiled weakly and moved on. The guilt gnawed at me, but every time I felt weak, I remembered the look on my parents' faces the day they fired me. My dad, stoic and cold. My mom, mumbling excuses about family harmony. Ethan, smirking in the corner like he'd just won a prize. That memory was the fire that kept me walking forward. Weeks turned into months as the acquisition process advanced. Arncrest prepared the offer. Lawyers drafted the contracts. I fine-tuned the integration plan, identifying which employees we'd keep, which assets we'd absorb, and which parts we'd liquidate. With every decision, I balanced on a knife's edge between justice and cruelty. Finally, the day came when Arncrest was ready to make its move. My CEO called me into his office once more. He slid a folder across the desk toward me. Inside was the official acquisition proposal. He looked me in the eye and said, "It's time. You'll be the one to present the offer to your parents." My stomach dropped. I had known this moment was coming, but hearing it out loud made my blood run cold. It was one thing to dismantle their company from behind the scenes. It was another to look them in the eye as I handed them the papers that would end their reign. And as I walked out of his office clutching that folder, one thought echoed in my head, louder than all the rest. They're finally going to see what choosing Ethan cost them. The morning I walked into my parents' office to deliver Arncrest's offer, I felt a strange mix of dread and anticipation. Every step down the familiar hallway echoed like a drumbeat in my chest. The carpet was worn, the walls the same beige I had stared at for years during endless meetings, but everything felt foreign now. I wasn't their obedient child anymore. I was the representative of the company that was about to buy them out, and deep down, I knew that nothing would ever feel the same again. My parents were waiting in the conference room. My mother's eyes were red-rimmed, my father's jaw tight. They greeted me politely but with a tension that was almost tangible. Ethan was there too, lounging in a chair like he owned the place, as if my presence wasn't a threat but a casual visit. I cleared my throat and placed the folder on the table. "This is the offer," I said, my voice measured calm, but with an undercurrent of something I didn't entirely recognize myself. Power? Satisfaction? Revenge? Probably all three. My father opened the folder, scanning the pages, and his face went from neutrality to disbelief to barely concealed anger. This is an acquisition offer?" he asked, his voice tight. "We thought you'd come back to help us save the company." I let the silence stretch. "I'm here on behalf of Arncrest," I said. "They're offering to acquire the company and integrate the assets. This is the best possible outcome for the business given its current state." Ethan laughed, a sharp, incredulous sound that grated against my ears. "You're kidding me. You're actually doing this? After everything we've done for you? After we gave you your start?" I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "You mean after you were allowed to coast while I did everything? After you kept the cushy salary and bonuses while I was let go?" My voice rose slightly, but I kept it controlled. "Do you honestly think I owe you anything?" My parents shifted uncomfortably. My mother spoke, her voice shaky. "We made mistakes. We were trying to save the company. We thought Ethan could handle it." I cut her off. "You thought he could handle it while throwing me out? I gave 10 years of my life to this company. I was loyal. I sacrificed everything. And this is what you chose." The room went silent, save for the sound of Ethan's shallow breathing. He looked like a cornered animal. My father's hands clenched into fists on the table. Finally, he said, "We didn't realize it would come to this." I shrugged, as if it were nothing. It's what happens when you make poor decisions. You gamble on incompetence, and eventually, it catches up to you. Arncrest's offer is fair. It's the only path forward. Take it or watch everything collapse. My mother's face crumpled. You're letting it end. After all these years? I'm not letting it end, I replied. It's ending because of choices that were made long before I walked in the door. I'm just formalizing reality. Ethan finally exploded. You're supposed to be family. You're supposed to help us. You're supposed to. I held up my hand. I was supposed to, yes, and I tried. You were allowed to coast. I was discarded. That's the difference between us. He didn't know how to respond. The truth hit harder than any argument. My parents, shocked and guilt-ridden, looked like they wanted to say something but couldn't. I could see the calculations running through their minds, how this acquisition would strip them of control, how Ethan's failures were finally laid bare. Then I delivered the final blow. This is your choice. Arncrest will finalize the deal unless you counteroffer, and I won't intervene. The decision is yours. But make no mistake, if you refuse, the company will collapse without me, and you'll have no one to blame but yourselves. I stood up, leaving the folder on the table. As I walked out, I could feel the weight of their shock behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had spoken my truth, laid it bare, and for the first time in a decade, I felt free. Outside, I exhaled, letting the tension release. But deep down, I knew the fallout had only just begun. Calls would be made, family arguments would erupt, and Ethan's arrogance would finally meet reality. As I got into my car, my phone buzzed. It was my grandmother. Her message was simple. Do what you think is right. We all saw what happened. And in that moment I realized I wasn't the villain. I was just the only one left who could face the truth. The days after I delivered the offer were some of the most surreal of my life. I watched from a distance as my parents tried to rally their remaining staff, scramble for emergency funding, and convince clients that everything was under control. But the truth was impossible to hide. Emails went unanswered, payroll was delayed, and rumors of unpaid vendors spread like wildfire. The house of cards Ethan had built was collapsing, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. I kept my distance, communicating only when Arncrest requested updates or clarifications. Each call from my parents felt like a dagger wrapped in nostalgia. My mother's voice quivered as she begged for advice. My father tried to maintain authority but sounded hollow, drained. And Ethan called me twice, once screaming, once crying, but both times expecting me to magically fix what he had destroyed. I stayed silent. I didn't need to fix anything. I had no desire to. The reality was theirs. Their choices had caught up with them. The press soon caught wind of the company's troubles. Local newspapers ran headlines about a once thriving regional business teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Friends and distant relatives called to express sympathy, but I knew their sympathy was really curiosity, the same way the world loves a scandal. My parents had built a reputation, a legacy, and I was witnessing it disintegrate before my eyes. Employees were leaving in droves. Those who had been loyal for years were quietly resigning, some even joining competitors. Ethan's vanity projects crumbled. Contracts were defaulted, suppliers withdrew credit. Every problem I had warned about years ago was unfolding in real time. My parents, desperate, started reaching out to me for help again. Please, you have to intervene, my father said one night during a call. We need you to save the company. I could hear the raw panic in his voice. I could feel the years of betrayal, the unfairness, the hypocrisy, boiling up in me. And I thought of the day they fired me, of Ethan lounging in his office while I carried the company on my back. I felt a cold clarity. I can't, I told him simply. This isn't my problem anymore. You made your choices. Now you live with the consequences. The silence on the other end was deafening. I could hear my mother gasp, trying to find words, but nothing came. Ethan hung up after muttering something incoherent about family and loyalty, and I didn't answer. Meanwhile, Arncrest moved forward. My role became pivotal in finalizing the acquisition. I led negotiations, identifying which assets Ironcrest would keep and which would be liquidated. Every decision was tactical, precise, and necessary, but also painful in a different sense. I was dismantling my family's empire with the same care I had once given it. But now there was no reward, no pride, no affection to soften the edges. The final meeting before the acquisition was a showdown of emotions. My parents sat across from me, their expressions a mix of pleading, fear, and disbelief. Ethan stared at me with a venom I had never seen before, rage and hurt battling on his face. "This is final," I said, my voice calm. "Ironcrest will take over, integrate the valuable parts, and liquidate the rest. Your options are to accept or refuse, but refusing won't save the company. It will just accelerate the collapse." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "You don't have to do this. You could save us." I shook my head. "I already saved you once by staying loyal, by giving you my years, my expertise, my life. You chose differently. Now it's your turn to face reality." Ethan erupted. "You're the worst. You're supposed to be family." I held his gaze. "I am family, but family doesn't mean you get to destroy me and expect forgiveness. You had your chance. You blew it." As I walked out of that room, the weight of every betrayal, every sleepless night, every ignored warning lifted. And yet, I felt an unexpected emptiness. I had one, yes, but at what cost? The empire my grandparents had built was gone. My parents were broken. Ethan was humiliated. And the world would never see the sacrifices I had made, only the cold, ruthless face of the person who let a family business die. That evening, I received a text from my grandmother. "Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel right, but you made your choice. Be strong." I stared at the message, and for the first time I understood the paradox. I wasn't the villain. I wasn't the hero. I was simply the only one left willing to face the truth. And somewhere deep down, I knew the confrontation wasn't over. Because family doesn't forget betrayal. The acquisition was finalized quietly, almost antiseptically. Ironcrest integrated the viable parts of my parents' company, the warehouses, some key client accounts, and the distribution networks, and liquidated the rest. I oversaw the transition, ensuring everything was executed cleanly, without unnecessary chaos. Yet, no matter how professional I remained, the reality of what had happened was impossible to ignore. At first, my parents didn't speak to me. Calls went unanswered, emails ignored. When they did attempt to reach me, it was with a tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. My father's pride was shattered. My mother's guilt palpable. Ethan was furious. He had lost the cushy position, the control he had always leaned on, and the illusion of his superiority crumbled like dry sand through his fingers. I received a terse voicemail from him, each word dripping with venom. "You've destroyed everything. You were supposed to be on our side. You're a monster. You've ruined us." I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. I hadn't ruined them. They had spent years gambling on incompetence and blind favoritism. I simply ensured that reality caught up to them. The fallout rippled through the family. Relatives and friends took sides, some privately praising me for finally holding my parents accountable, others condemning me as cold-hearted. Social gatherings turned awkward, with hushed whispers behind my back. My parents, humiliated and enraged, avoided me entirely. Ethan, however, confronted me directly at a distant cousin's wedding. He cornered me behind the ballroom, his face red, shaking with rage and disbelief. How could you just take everything? Did it ever occur to you that we're your family? That we trusted you?" I looked at him steadily, my chest tight but my voice calm. "Family doesn't mean you get to discard me when it suits you and then expect loyalty when it suits you. I gave years of my life to this company. You did nothing. And now you're facing the consequences of your choices." He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You think you're the hero here? You think the world sees what you did as justice?" "No," I said. "The world sees what I did as truth. You lost the business because of your actions, not because of me. I just made the truth unavoidable." He stormed off, leaving me standing alone, the noise of the wedding fading behind me. I felt a strange mix of triumph and sorrow. Triumph because finally the scales had been balanced. Sorrow because the family I had once believed in, the people I had sacrificed for, had proven incapable of honoring loyalty or hard work. Days turned into weeks. My parents finally broke their silence. They reached out, not for reconciliation, but for confrontation. Their messages were filled with anger, accusations, and thinly veiled guilt. My father accused me of betrayal, my mother of cruelty. Ethan's attempts at communication ranged from desperate pleading to passive-aggressive jabs. And yet, I noticed something strange. As they vented, as they fumed, as they tried to guilt me into feeling remorse, a part of them was beginning to understand. Deep down, they knew they had squandered my years of effort, that they had ignored the warnings I had given them. Their anger was, in a way, a reflection of their own guilt. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let them stew. Silence became my ally. And in that silence, I realized something profound. I had finally reclaimed my power, not through revenge or spite, but simply by acknowledging my own worth. But even as I felt the weight lift, I knew the final chapter wasn't over. Ethan, humiliated and bitter, wasn't someone who would quietly accept defeat. And my parents, proud and stubborn, wouldn't forgive what they saw as betrayal. The family, fractured and wounded, was still a living, breathing storm, and the next confrontation was inevitable. Late one night, I received a message from my mother. Short, simple, loaded with unspoken meaning. "You've changed everything. How could you?" I stared at it for a long time, knowing that my answer wasn't words. My actions had already spoken louder than any explanation could. And in that moment, I understood the truth I had been running from. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel right to those who were never right to begin with. The weeks after the acquisition settled into an uneasy calm. Ironcrest had successfully absorbed the assets, employees had been reassigned or let go, and the remnants of my parents' company were being liquidated. I watched from the sidelines as my parents confronted the reality they had refused to face for years. Their empire, once a point of pride, a tangible testament to decades of effort, was gone. My father avoided me entirely, his pride wounded beyond repair. My mother's attempts at contact were sporadic, awkward, and always laced with guilt. Ethan, humiliated and stripped of his illusion of power, alternated between anger and despondency. I could see him slowly realizing that the world did not bend to accommodate arrogance, laziness, or entitlement. I felt a strange mix of emotions myself. On the one hand, I had won. I had reclaimed my worth, my authority, and my dignity. I had turned a traumatic experience into a position of power and independence. On the other hand, there was a lingering ache, a grief for the family I had believed in, the legacy I had once loved, and the innocence of my younger self who thought loyalty and hard work would be enough. Then came the family meeting. My grandmother insisted on hosting a dinner, inviting all of us in an attempt to salvage some semblance of connection. I went, cautious, bracing for conflict. The dinner was tense. Conversations were stilted. Ethan glared at me across the table. My parents avoided eye contact, and my grandmother tried to fill the silence with gentle reminders of shared memories. Finally, my father spoke, his voice low and defeated. "I suppose we underestimated you. We underestimated everything." My mother added, her voice trembling, "We made mistakes. Horrible mistakes." Ethan, unable to hold back, blurted, "You didn't have to destroy us. You could have saved us." I took a deep breath. I looked at them all, at the faces that had once defined my world, and said the truth. "I didn't destroy you. You destroyed yourselves. I gave years of my life to this company, to this family, believing in loyalty, hard work, and integrity. You chose to discard me. You chose to enable incompetence. I'm not a villain. I'm just the one who faced the reality you refused to see." There was silence. Then my grandmother spoke softly. "Sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that show people the truth they refuse to see." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. but it was acknowledgement, and in that I found some peace. I realized that being the executioner didn't make me heartless. It made me honest. It made me accountable, not to them but to myself. Later that night, after the family had dispersed, I sat alone reflecting on the journey. I remembered the anger, the betrayal, the sleepless nights, and the overwhelming grief. I remembered the small victories, the professional triumphs, and the quiet satisfaction of reclaiming my life. And I realized something profound. The world doesn't owe us justice. It's up to us to define our own path. So here I am asking the internet, AITA, for letting my parents' company collapse after they fired me to save money, but kept my lazy brother? I did not act out of spite. I did not sabotage them. I simply allowed the consequences of their decisions to unfold. I acted in truth, in reality, and in fairness to myself. But the emotional weight of it, the family ties, the expectations, the heartbreak, leaves me wondering if, in some way, I am still the villain in their story. Because sometimes, even when you do the right thing, the people you love, and who claim to love you, see it as betrayal.